having a massive conversation about this intimacy. We see a weird paradox of hypersexualized media alongside a documented intimacy recession in real life. So, where people are increasingly become lonely and disconnected. So, by writing sex through an anthropological lens in Firebound, what are you trying to show modern readers about what truly physical and psychological connection looks like when you strip away the modern noise?
One of my favorite authors and mentors is Tara Perel. I don't know if you know her, but she's a practicing psychologist and she's written a lot about this modern phenomenon, dopamine addiction, instant gratification, almost like overexposure to certain themes that makes us numb. I think we're really living through this very strange paradox where media is hypersexualized and people are looking for a connection, but connection is not something that happens instantly. It's a build-up. So as an anthropologist, I look at sex not just as a romance trope. It's a fundamental human touchstone. And so in Linde's world, there is no digital barrier and the intimacy is raw, physical, it's deeply vulnerable. And so stripping away this modern noise, I wanted to show that true connection isn't about a perfectly choreographed romance. It really is often about two traumatized people learning to communicate through sometimes gritty and awkward reality of the human body.
Hello everyone and welcome back to Pages of Pandora. Today we are stepping into this story that feels incredibly raw, deeply researched and unlike anything else on the shelves right now. Our guest has spent over 15 years working as a behavioral scientist and technologist at Google, analyzing the complex patterns of how humans survive and find agency inside rigid systems. Now she is taking that exact analytical lens and using it to bring the 10th century Viking world to life. Valerie Nilsson is the author of Firebound, Book 1, Emerald to Steel, the explosive debut of a planned 4-book saga. The story follows Linde, an autistic princess and witch healer who processes a high superstitious world through the precise logic of anatomy, stars, and pattern recognition. When she is captured and thrown into this brutal reality of medieval slave markets, her only anchor becomes Gustav, a fierce Viking king known as the Bear of the North. This book completely upends the traditional historical fantasy genre, giving us a deeply visceral look at trauma, own voices, neurodivergence, and what it truly means for a woman to reclaim her mind and body. Valerie, thank you so much for joining me today and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
It's my pleasure, and I want to start from the very beginning that you had a long career at Google studying human behavior and how people adapt to tough systems. So, what made you decide that 10th century historical fiction novel was the best way to explore how these human patterns works?
Sure. It does sound like a leap, right? Going from a tech strategy, product strategy, to 10th century Viking world. But as an anthropologist, the core subject is exactly the same. It's about human survival and adaptation. And in tech, we'll look at how humans adapt to massive invisible systems like algorithm data flows, global networks. And in 10th century, the systems were just as rigid, but they were social, environmental, they were physical. And so I wanted to strip away the screens and the modern noise and all of the safety nets that we have today, and look really at the rawest version of human resilience, what it truly looks like. So writing the saga allowed me to put this analytical mind, Linde, the protagonist, into an environment where understanding the system isn't just about optimizing a product, but it's about surviving.
Yeah, and honestly, that makes so much of sense because it's crazy how whether you are looking at tech system or 10th century culture pattern, human nature really has not changed in that while, right? That core pattern is still there.
Yeah, I also think that we have this inherent bias that history is linear and that we know better than our ancestors. And in some ways we do, but in some ways we can actually learn from them. So that makes this whole process super interesting.
Yeah. My next question is your writing is incredibly atmospheric. Readers can practically smell the wood smoke and copper in the air. So, how do you go about building a scene so that it feels like a real physical experience rather than just words on the paper?
So that really comes through a neurodivergent lens. I'm autistic and my protagonist is autistic as well. And so the world isn't just a backdrop for our senses, it's a constant, sometimes overwhelming flood of sensory input. So when I'm building a scene, I don't just think about what it looks like, I think about the temperature in the air, the exact scent of the wood smoke, the texture of the wool against the skin. And so because Linde's brain processes everything clinically and somatically, the reader has to feel the physical weight of the room just as intensely as she does.
Yeah, I mean, you can absolutely feel that level of detail on the page, and it really makes reading feel almost like tactile, like you are actually sitting beside that fireside. And it is also rare to find world building that immersive. So my next question is, fantasy genre is filled with this classic princess heroine, but Linde's process a world through a distinct neurodivergent lens. So why was it so important to bring an own voice autistic representation into this brutal 10th century setting?
I love this question. Historically, I think fantasy and romance genres haven't really made a lot of space for neurodivergent women. And there's this unspoken assumption that being autistic is a modern phenomenon, but it's not. We have always existed. Our ancestors just didn't use the same medical or clinical vocabulary that we use today, but they did have different cultural containers. And so cultural container is actually an anthropological term. It's what allows a person to find their space, their role in the community and in the society. And so I really was curious to explore what an autistic woman, what her life would look like before the medical model existed, the modern medical model. Obviously, there were different medical models in place. And so for Linde, her neurodivergence is obviously, not a modern diagnosis. It's part of her personality. It's part of our space in the world. And sometimes her ability to recognize patterns and her sensory depth and hyperfocus is what keeps her alive, and sometimes it becomes a problem, which is very similar to your modern experience, right? It's just described in different terms.
Right. And that really brings me to my next question, which is like our culture is having a massive conversation about this intimacy. We see a weird paradox of hypersexualized media alongside a documented intimacy recession in real life. So, where people are increasingly become lonely and disconnected. So, by writing sex through an anthropological lens in Firebound, what are you trying to show modern readers about what truly physical and psychological connection looks like when you strip away the modern noise?
One of my favorite authors and mentors is Esther Perel. I don't know if you know her, but she's a practicing psychologist, and she's written a lot about this modern phenomenon of dopamine addiction, instant gratification, almost like overexposure to certain themes that makes us numb towards those themes in the end. And so I think we're really living through this very strange paradox where media is definitely, to your point, hypersexualized, and people are really experiencing a profound intimacy recession. So we are incredibly lonely in the end because people are looking for a connection, but the connection is not something that happens instantly. It's a build-up. It's a slow burn. So as an anthropologist, I look at sex not just as a romance trope. It's a fundamental human touchstone. And so in Linde's world, there is no digital barrier, and the intimacy is raw, physical. It's deeply vulnerable. And so stripping away this modern noise, I wanted to show that true connection isn't about the perfectly choreographed romance, the pretty scenes. It really is often about two traumatized people learning to communicate through sometimes gritty and awkward and also profoundly grounding reality of the human body.
Yeah, that is such a good point. It's like you strip away all the noise and screen time we have today, and intimacy just comes down to this raw trust and safety. And it really feels way more real reading in that way.
Yeah, I really did want to take Esther Perel's clinical observations about human desire and sort of strip them down to the raw 10th century roots. But I've been writing about it in my nonfiction essays as well. It's a really important phenomenon that is worth discussing and shedding the light to.
Right. So we like to think that we are the most connected generation in human history because of the internet. Yet your book shows us 10th century world where Eastern spirit, Southern logic and Northern iron were constantly flowing and clashing across trade routes. So do you think ancient people were actually more culturally fluid and open to global synthesis than we are today despite our technology?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, and it kind of goes back to that point that I raised previously, which is we have this collective bias that history is linear and our ancestors were not as good and virtuous, and we are. And we all know that that is not true. We are not perfect, and our ancestors were highly intelligent. And so, as an anthropologist, I'm super curious to analyze and discover that true history. And so ultimately, when you look at that 10th century world, you actually realize that they were trade routes. There's Varangian Guard, there is the Byzantium Empire, there is the Silk Road. The world was incredibly porous. So you had, to your point, Northern Ireland meeting Southern logic and Eastern spirituality constantly, and all this wisdom was exchanged. People were trading not just goods; they were trading medical techniques, philosophies, survival strategies. So in many ways, because their survival depended on adaptation, ancient people were often much more willing to synthesize new ideas than we are in our modern and very algorithmically siloed echo chambers.
Yeah, like it's a kind of wild to realize that, isn't it? Like we think we have invented globalization, but people were still trading ideas, medicine, and culture across this huge distance away before we even had the internet.
Absolutely. Internet did not invent globalization.
Yeah. So there is this modern misconception that the historical world was deeply isolated, but your books show a very different kind of reality. So how do the cross-cultural tradition in your story, particularly regarding the medicine and healing, reflect the true interconnectedness of our ancestors?
Yeah, so medicine is the ultimate proof of historical globalization. So a healer in 10th century wasn't operating in a vacuum. So as we look at our protagonist, Linde, she embodies this. She is trained in Northern Pagan herbalism, and she also uses advanced Eastern surgical techniques. Not to share any spoilers, but throughout the books, Linde will meet and work with and learn from different healers who then become her mentors and teach her new ways to practice medicine based on their sort of where they're from. And one great example in book 1 and 2 is actually Sael, who's a seer, and Sael becomes Linda's most important mentor throughout the series. So historically, we see that armies and merchants, they carried medical knowledge across borders faster than anything else, because sickness doesn't care about where you're from, and neither does the cure. And so Linda's approach, what she calls third way, is a direct reflection of how human beings have always shared knowledge to survive.
Yeah, right. So you feature this ancient female-driven rites like cupola and Latin in your work. So from your anthropological perspective, how did rituals like this act as essential framework for women and communities to process hardship, loss, grief, and what we have lost by forgetting them?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite topics. It really ties back to female empowerment and women, supporting each other, because it's really hard to be a woman. It's very hard to be a human being in general, but women have their particular hardships, and so what we see in in the ancient times is that there were communities of women that were very tightly knit. There was knowledge exchange. Today when we experience grief and trauma, they can become highly individualized. So you go to the therapist, you process it alone, but ancient societies understood that human beings shatter under isolated grief, for example. So rituals like cupola and latine were the examples of cultural containers we spoke of before. They were spaces explicitly designed and held by women to collectively process hardship, loss, and the big transitions of your life and your body, like childbirth, like coming of age, like um, you know, um, they didn't have the same word for it. We have like a medical word like menopause, but they also had transitions for this kind of periods of life. And so what's so important to understand is that these rituals were also highly somatic. So you didn't just sit in a circle and talk. They were, physical experiences. They utilized dance and song and touch, and even in some cases eroticism, to actively move emotion and trauma through the physical body. And so by losing these communal female-driven frameworks, I think we've lost some of that cultural infrastructure that used to catch us when we fell.
Yeah, like it makes you realize how much space we have lost in modern life for just processing things together as a community. Like we kind of left those frameworks behind.
Absolutely.
So in contemporary media, there is this huge push for storing strong female leads, but they are often written just like male action heroes with weapons. But Linde's strength is entirely different. It's somatic, medical, and deeply analytical. So do you think modern culture has forgotten how to value intellectual and sensory precision as a form of raw survival?
I think the modern culture really anchors in strength being defined in very masculine terms. And it's not just gender related, right? There is a feminine and masculine regardless of the gender as a concept. And so I think that when we look at the modern strong female lead, like the definition of strong, it's often just like a traditional male action hero.
Yeah.
Put into a woman's body, and so she wields a sword, she punches her way out of problems, and there's a place for that, of course. You had shield maidens at that time as well, but Linda's strength is entirely different. So her battlefield is the operating table. So she's a healer, and her weapon is her intellect. So she survives, not by fighting, but by observing, analyzing, and then ultimately, wiggling herself out of a difficult situation, asking for help. So we actually, in our modern world, severely undervalue this quiet, somatic and clinical strength, the wisdom, the patience, that is also really strength that can help you maintain your mind in the world that is actively trying to break you.
Yeah, like 100% giving a female lead with sword, it's kind of look cool, but showing someone survive through sheer observation and medical skill, I mean, to me, that is more terrifying and powerful.
I think it's also empowering because, especially when we're talking about themes like neurodivergence, disability, there's this assumption that if you had a disability in ancient times, that was it. You had no support,
Yeah.
which really turns out not to be true. It turns out that people were embraced by the communities. They thrived. There are numerous examples and actual physical proof of, burials of, for example, people with Down syndrome that were cherished, that were loved and respected. Because, human value and human strength does not just come from sort of the outward or the more like superficial attributes. They come through this net of different different ways we engage in the world and different ways that we bring value. So I think that's a really important topic that keeps coming back in the book as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And putting your first fiction book out there, especially one that is so personal and draws from own voices, neurodivergence, takes a lot of guts. So, what advice would you give to another professional secretly writing a book in their spare hours, but who is too scared to hit publish?
I would say just do it, and I know it's easier said than done. But when you spend your days analyzing system, building strategies, being the logical professional, and living your life. Like I grew up in the tech world. I was a PhD dropout when I started at Google. That's my entire career. Writing about things that are a bit more, personal, raw, creative, exposing this messy side of the world can be really terrifying. And so those two halves of your brain actually are not at war, they feed each other. And so writing the series, I've actually fully written 4 books, and even though I just put 2 of them out there, it required the same skills and discipline and strategic planning that my job required. But honestly, what really pushed me over the edge was not just discipline. I looked at other people who were brave first. And so I think it's always really important to give credit to your mentors, even parasocial ones. And so I remember just, seeing examples of people who had massive platform who were way more open about their neurodivergence and seeing them risk that kind of exposure on such a huge stage made me stop and look at my own fears. And I realized I'm just a new author. Why am I so afraid? Worst case scenario, nobody will read it. So my advice is find those examples of vulnerability, even from afar, and just let them give you this permission to be brave. Your professional skills are a massive asset to your creative life, and so don't hide one to protect another.
Yeah, I love that point. It's a quite practical advice you give. So I want to know, you spent over decades and half at Google analyzing massive data sets and contemporary human system. Now you have pivoted to writing an intensive sensory 4-book historical fiction saga. So what was the most challenging part of translating your deep scientific understanding of human behavior into this raw, unpredictable 10th century world without making your characters sound like modern psychologists in disguise?
So I think the hardest part was stripping away the modern vocabulary. Like I couldn't just let Linde say she was experiencing sensory overload or autistic burnout and Gustav had PTSD or depression. But I had to translate those modern clinical concepts into the somatic reality of the 10th century. So instead of anxiety, I had to write about the physical sensation of the racing heart and ringing in the ears. Instead of trauma, I had to write about ghosts and shadows and the physical flinching of muscle memory. And so I had to let the body tell the story that modern psychology would otherwise just summarize with a label. And that was honestly one of the most interesting parts of the journey, this particular analysis. Like, how did our ancestors cope with that? How would they approach it? How would that feel? And describing that in detail, I think it was super fun to do.
Wow. Actually, that balance takes so much of discipline, but you nailed it. The characters feels entirely grounded in their own time and belief, yet their emotional core feels completely universal to us today.
Thank you.
So I want to know, since you mentioned that it's a 4-book saga, so have you written all of them, or are you still working on them?
I have written all of them. I do have a fun story about book 4. So I have actually written book 4 fully, but then the last chapters, like the ending, I have written 2 different arcs.
Okay.
It can go in 2 different directions, and they are both sort of really legit. And so what I ultimately would love to do is, as people are reading book 1 and 2, and 3, if I ultimately can get, because there are some people who are writing, who are writing like their observations, their questions, sometimes like their feedback about what they're reading. And what I would love is to have a community of people who can almost then sort of help me navigate which arc I'll ultimately go with. And then, perhaps it'll be a book 5 and 6. As you read further, you also see sort of the family dynamic evolve, and Linda's children are becoming older, and so there's like a whole new possible world out there.
Yeah. So you can do this thing now. You can publish like volume 1 and volume 2 of 4th book.
You mean like if I go with both?
Yeah, like you can publish both of them in both the volumes.
I mean, I could maybe. I really love like all the ways that are available to authors today to publish their work. Like for instance, I started writing on Substack, so I was writing essays and articles because I was doing a lot of consultancy in the past. And so what helped me, with consultancy and public speaking is that you write things down. And so it's kind of like one too many. You don't have to like say it to small groups of people. You can just publish it and make it available. But then I stopped doing consultancy really and public speaking because I don't have time, and I also decided to pivot more into creative writing. But I did discover Substack is this amazing platform where you can publish anything, and it's essentially a platform of writers, and so everyone writes there, so you can read stuff. It's amazing. So I started publishing book one. I just make book one's chapters available free of charge, and I've added to each chapter, I've added an anthropology analysis. And so that has also been like a really interesting journey. It's like when I write about, for example, the ritual of Linde, there's like a whole historical analysis of what it actually was. It was really, an existing ritual, what it entailed, why it existed, how it was functional. And so I think for book four, what I could experiment with is publish some versions of the arc and then sort of test it out and see if people respond to that. But like in life, there are many different possibilities, like many different options. And so I think that is also something to think about.
Yeah, understandable. Also, I want to know one thing, that you have already written all the 4 books. So, like, how did you come up with the ending? Like, did you already have this thing in your mind that I know how this book series is going to go, or like as you discover as you go writing those books? Because it's very hard to even come up with the one book idea, and you have written 4 books.
I think that so book one, or sort of the anchor of the story, this setup, it was living in my mind for a very long time. It's kind of like it just sort of nested itself in like series of systems, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. So I was like, I have to write it down, and then everything just started flowing, like the names, the context, and then I started doing a lot of research on, okay, well, how was that world? Okay, 10th century. Actually, I really love this time period. It's my favorite time period, to be honest. So I think that really helped to unpack that. But in terms of art development, there are many different ways that I've tested out. And as you know, writing is rewriting. And so, I think book one, I've rewritten maybe like 20 times. Each chapter had a different angle, a different version. It's been all rewritten. And I think obviously there are other options possible, right? That there are other ways. I've actually rewritten like the ending of chapter one several times, book one several times. I think I wanted to break the saga up in books because they all represent different stages of Linde's life. So she's sort of like a young person falling in love for the first time, meeting her partner in book one. Then book two is all about her finding herself, as a healer, and then also as they sort of grow and things happen that like puts their marriage to the test. And then book three is going to be more about the motherhood, and I don't want to share any spoilers, but each book represents a different stage of life and her evolution. And so the way I chose the ending was sort of both, okay, we're at the end of this particular stage of our life, but we are also teeing up the next one. And so there's like this transition to the next book. So I think honestly, when I look at one of the arcs that I've written for book four, I absolutely foresee that there's going to be a book 5 and probably more, just based on how that story evolves.
So you did not end in book 4, like you're trying to expand the story to book 5 and 6 and then 7, something like that. It will be like a universe then.
I just haven't written it yet, and I just need to sort of conceptually think about it. And the way it starts, it usually just starts in my mind, and I don't really think it in words. It just sort of nests itself as a concept, and then once I have this idea, it's almost like a flicker, and then I just have to write it down to look at it, and then I just sort of look at it, and then I start analyzing, I start researching, like, does that make sense? And I love psychology. I mentioned Esther Perel is one of my favorite authors. She writes nonfiction, but I read a lot of nonfiction. But I read a lot of stuff when I was a kid. I was the kid who just read, like that's all I did. I was just reading, and I read a lot of sort of grown-up literature. And one of my favorite was Dostoevsky, who it really is
Yeah,
the
I mean, I
founder
also
of
read Dostoevsky. Yeah.
yeah. And so you know how he really unpacks the characters, and,
Yeah.
and he really goes in depth to um, like this dungeons of the human nature,
Yeah.
and thoughts and the fears. And so I absolutely love that. I'm inspired by that. And so when I start unpacking the arcs of like the flickers that live in my mind, I usually start thinking about, okay, how would that person feel? What would they do? And obviously I'm a new writer, so I'm not amazing at that, but this is something that I'm actively working on. For instance, in book 2, I really tried to give Gustav perspective, because we also often just go off, okay, well, she's a female protagonist, and now, her marriage is challenged, what is going on? But I really wanted to look at his side,
Yeah.
like what was happening to him, as a young boy, that has led him to experience this particular situation in a way that, made him act a certain way. And so I really love just doing that kind of analysis. And then I usually test out, like both sort of the internal monologue and the dialogue, and how would they, want to communicate that, how would they respond to some of the things. And I find it really, really fascinating, like as an activity.
Yeah. So I wanted to know one more thing, like the characters, like it's a work of fiction, it's a historical fiction book, but like are the characters are inspired by some kind of real life characters, like in your life, or something that you have read somewhere or you have watched somewhere?
Not consciously, but I mean, inadvertently, as a human being, obviously, there are people in my life that absolutely play a role in sort of that character development. I wouldn't say, one character is like this one person that I know, but I think like the character traits,
Yeah.
it all does sit there. I think there are like broader concepts. For instance, the protagonist, like the way her mind operates, is largely written based on how my mind operates. So there's a lot of similarities there, like how she would perceive reality, and sort of the autistic traits. So like the directness, like I will say what I want, I will say how I feel, I'm not judging, I'm just saying,
Yeah.
very directly. But then also like the precision, and then the sort of the over functioning. I need to solve this problem, and I'm the one who has to solve it, and then sort of getting into that autistic burnout mode. Then you have key characters like Layla, and Layla is, a sister-in-law, but she's more of a true sister. And, she represents this female communal, very, very strong and powerful support that Linde has, and the access to, that friendship and that collective wisdom. So I wouldn't say Layla is someone that I know, but, I have a bunch of friends who have Layla's traits, and who are like Layla to me, right, in hard times. And then obviously there's like other characters that I really wanted to give a voice to. For instance, Sael, who is a, they are non-binary, so they don't have a specific gender. And I wanted to explore how that would look like in the 10th century Europe. And I was so surprised to learn that actually that was, I wouldn't say it wasn't difficult. Like, obviously, it's always difficult when you're different, but there were cultural containers. So for someone like Sal to be a seer and to be sort of this holder of the world in between, it just made so much sense. And then there were other characters as well, like the younger brother, the children. I have 2 children, I have a brother. So there's like a lot of the dynamic and sort of the relationship arcs. Of course, I will be inspired and sort of informed by my own experience in real life.
Right. Like It was a great conversation, really thoughtful, and it's always good to know the story from the person who have written it. Like there are two kind of perspective. One, the reader, how readers have perceived the perspective, and how one has written the book. So it is really good to interact with you. It has been a very thoughtful conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today in the morning. And to everyone listening out there, do check out the book. It's available on Amazon, and you can also go to Substack. I have mentioned all the details in the description. You can click on that link, and you can also subscribe and follow the author on Substack, Instagram to stay connected with her creative journey. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and thank you for giving authors the platform to talk about their work. I think it's, to your point, equally important to talk about how we write and why we write. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure. Like I've got to learn a lot of things today. I have a kind of humanity background, but I have not studied anthropology in my college. I come from a political science background, but this book gave me a completely new perspective on human nature and the psychological thing. Lastly, thank you so much.
I love that. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day ahead.
All right. Thanks. Talk to you soon.